Yet another component in the subtextual arsenal of the fiction writer is the metaphor. Metaphors convey more information than what literally appears on the page through analogy. But why are they so prevalent in fiction? Why do fiction writers so consistently apply this tool? Perhaps the answer to those questions can be had by first understanding how metaphors work. What exactly do metaphors do cognitively? For that answer, we're going to need a little help from our friends, the cognitive linguists. But first, let's get a general sense for what metaphors are. Metaphors, according to most definitions, are pithy comparisons that talk about one thing as if it were another. This allows the writer to convey a sense of familiarity to a situation that may be totally new to the reader. Or, metaphors may convey a quicker sense of clarity than a straight description of the situation would. This is the utility of the metaphor. Essentially, they're cognitive shortcuts, allowing a person to learn something new by using old, well-understood ideas, concepts, or imagery. This is one of the reasons people use metaphors so incessantly. And you might be thinking, well, I'm not so sure I use metaphors all that often, Ro. I can't even remember the last time I busted out a good old-fashioned metaphor. Well, you'd be wrong if you were thinking that. We use metaphors so constantly that most of them don't even register as being metaphors to us. I am wiped out. There's one. Elvira's flowing black hair hypnotized the young men at the party. There's two. The pressure of working the phones at the Cancer Fund's annual membership drive left Andre totally drained. There's three. Most of these metaphors you probably need to go looking for to even realize the metaphorical nature of these common expressions. We have hundreds of words in English that derive their meaning metaphorically. Politics, for instance, takes its meaning from the ancient Greek word for city, polis, representing the civic duties that go along with managing the day-to-day decisions that face a city-state. Metaphors are everywhere. The reason we don't recognize most metaphors is that they've become so familiar we don't need to remember the association anymore. Essentially, the unfamiliar has become just as familiar as the original referent. Cognitive linguists call these dead metaphors. Most metaphors, writes Steven Pinker, are dead metaphors, like coming to a head, which people would probably stop using if they knew that it alludes to the buildup of pus in a pimple. Before they go to die, though, often these future dead metaphors manifest themselves as cliches, which many writing instructors instruct writers to avoid using at all cost. I'm going to use a few here, though, because I have a window of opportunity to scrape the bottom of the barrel, merely touching the tip of the iceberg of dead horses I can beat to death by using the free pass I have to use as many cliches in one sentence as a single writer would ever dare to dream. Dear, oh dear. I think a healthy part of the wisdom undergirding the avoidance of cliches is that the analogy ceases to convey its idea with the kind of surprise that a novel and apt metaphor often does. This is a convention too, though, and cliches only become cliches by dint of their utility in conveying a common idea. Certainly you wouldn't want your writing littered with them, but I'm not so certain we need to root out every last one and salt the earth for good measure, as long as we're self-aware. So, metaphors, whether they come in dead, cliché, or novel form, must be useful if they're so prolific in our speech. And they certainly are both prolific and useful. One might think of metaphors as a kind of linguistic bootstrapping tool. Bootstrapping, itself a metaphor, is a process whereby a system self-improves without external input. One concept allows for the development of the next, and so forth. Metaphors serve as linguistic bootstrapping by allowing us to linguistically express a vast array of phenomena using information that we already know. Pinker gives the example of a kettle boiling over to describe diverse situations that are similar in some way, like the feud between Jody and Todd, the result of mixing vinegar and baking soda, or the rising waters above a dam, all things that are literally unrelated. This versatility helps us to explain new phenomena easily, especially with newcomers totally out of their element. According to Pinker, metaphors can be most useful with difficult ideas. Children may not understand politics or intellectual argumentation, but they surely understand rubber bands and fistfights, which, when cleverly analogized, stand in quite well for the rough and tumble worlds of politics and intellectual debate. Now, all this might be well and good, but it doesn't go very far in explaining the phenomenon of the metaphor as it commonly presents in the literary sense. And fortunately for us, Pinker has evaluated this too. According to Pinker, literary metaphors need to do two things to work well. First, the metaphor must make a clear and useful link between its source, the already well-known information, and its target, the novel situation being described. Second, it should accurately convey an emotional coloring from the source to the target. Pinker gives the example of former British Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli's famous quote, "I have climbed to the top of the greasy pole." The source in this case is the image of climbing to the top of a greased pole, and the target is the world of British politics. This metaphor succeeds by making a clear link between the difficulty of climbing up a greased pole and the difficulty of rising to the top of the parliamentary pecking order. Great start! But this metaphor is only successful on both fronts because the greasy imagery carries with it an emotional coloring that fits politics well. It's dirty, slimy, hard to wipe off, and largely unpleasant. Ideally, literary metaphors should perform both functions equally well. Part of knowing how metaphors can be done right is knowing how they can go wrong. Pinker offers a few guidelines here as well. There are essentially three ways a metaphor can go off the rails, sometimes comically so, as evidenced by Pinker's examples. The first metaphor mistake is a source that adds no useful information about its target. Essentially, the example doesn't help the reader to understand the situation any further than what they already know from straight description. Pinker offers the following two examples. John and Mary had never met. They were like two hummingbirds who had also never met. And the thunder was ominous sounding, much like the sound of a thin sheet of metal being shaken backstage during the storm scene in a play. These examples both seem silly, precisely because they convey nothing except the cluelessness of the writer. Few badly formed metaphors are going to be this comically obvious. The point here is to make certain that if you add a metaphor, it's actually adding something to the reader's understanding of the new situation. Second metaphor faux pas is when the writer needs to work so hard to explain the connection that it defeats the purpose of the metaphor's addition in the first place. Here's Pinker's example. He spoke with the wisdom that can only come from experience, like a guy who went blind because he looked at a solar eclipse without one of those boxes with a pinhole in it, and now goes around the country speaking at high schools about the dangers of looking at solar eclipses without one of those boxes with a pinhole in it. Again, an extreme example to get the point across. Metaphors should be quick, sharp, and pithy. If it takes longer than the description would, it's probably ill-founded. Lastly, the most egregious of metaphor mistakes comes about when the emotional coloring of the source clashes so badly with the target that atrocities like this happen. The ballerina rose gracefully on point and extended one slender leg behind her, like a dog at a fire hydrant. Or, my personal favorite, McBride fell 12 stories, hitting the pavement like a hefty bag filled with vegetable soup. Pinker's comical examples show what can happen when the emotional coloring is really off. And yeah, you don't really want to do this. The truth is, if you're inclined to do any of these things so egregiously with any degree of regularity, neither I, nor anyone else, nor any set of lessons or guidelines can really help you. But if you're like most writers who spin the occasional metaphor into her tale, without feeling 100% that it's ringing true, think about the two things a metaphor should do: add a clear analogical association and an emotional coloring. And if you don't think those two things are happening with any degree of confidence, why force the issue? I've mentioned Pinker's do-nots here because I think they're quite useful benchmarks to measure your metaphors against. But I'd be remiss if I didn't include at least a couple cases where I think metaphors work really well and sharpen or beautify a piece of fiction. The first case I think is excellent for its brevity. Technically, the following examples are hyphenated similes, but let's not get too persnickety. We're talking about the cases that fall under the giant patio-sized umbrella of all things metaphorical. And there's a lot of different types of metaphors under this umbrella, usually with ridiculous and complex names like synecdoche or metonymy or something of the sort. I'm sure there must be a linguistic or literary term specific to this first type of metaphor, but I've never come across it, so I simply call this the hyphen-like metaphor. They go like this. Boo, at 5, ran around the field with unbridled joy, kitten-like, hopping after the butterflies with surprising dexterity. Or, Vera lay prone on the grass, posing, sphinx-like, musing on the beauty of some distant place. Now, neither of these are particularly beautiful or evocative, and they're certainly not overly original. But you might think of the hyphen-like metaphor as the fast-acting formula. It gets the job done quickly without much ado, and they're much easier to apply than the whole Megillah. The other type of metaphor that I appreciate is one that conveys a visual image. I'm sure you won't be shocked when I offer you 2 examples from Melville. His writing is overflowing with metaphors, and they aren't all winners. Frankly, a great many of them require footnotes to understand, because the reference that might have been obvious to any literate reader in the 1850s have become more than a little obscure with the passage of time. But such a vast array of metaphors of different types leaves clues as to which metaphors will truly endure, and inevitably I find myself most enamored with the simplicity of a visual image that just can't be missed. Here's a brief one to start. The ship tore on, leaving such a furrow in the sea as when a cannonball missent becomes a plowshare and turns up the level field. This metaphor hits on both Pinker's requirements. It adds useful, analogous information about the target by describing the source, and that source, the cannonball, conveys the emotional coloring of the ship tearing through the waves with the alacrity of a cannonball. It's simple, functional, and presents an image of a ship so bent on the whale chase that it leaves a proper hole in the waves behind it. The longer one here I love for the same reasons, but in true Melville fashion, he stretches this one out, decorating the image in such lyrical prose as only he can. This is toward the end of the book when Ishmael's companion, Queequeg, catches an illness that leaves him in the following state on his deathbed. But, as all else in him thinned, and his cheekbones grew sharper, his eyes, nevertheless, seem growing fuller and fuller. They became of a strange softness of luster, and mildly but deeply looked out at you there from his sickness, a wondrous testimony to that immortal health in him, which could not die, or be weakened, and, like circles on the water, which, as they grow fainter, expand, so his eyes seemed rounding and rounding like the rings of eternity. I love this image, partly because it's visual, and partly because of its simple beauty, and let's face it, so his eyes seem rounding and rounding like the rings of eternity. The guy was just damn good. You can't teach that, but you can learn from it. So start with the ground rules we've discussed here, and head on out to the wide world of fiction with your eyes trained to pick out your favorite metaphors. Take notes as to how the target is described by the source. See if you can discern the way the emotional coloring of the source paints the target with its meaning. Like any other aspect of fiction writing, metaphors can be cleverly crafted and add descriptive beauty and force to your writing. Or they could fall flat, like a hefty bag filled with vegetable soup. Making sure they don't fall flat may take patience, but let's not mistake the ornaments with the tree here. Metaphors can be beautiful decorations to add flair to your writing, but the story is the tree in this barely passable Christmas tree metaphor. Don't despair if metaphors aren't your bag. There's always the other 99.9% of the story to make up for that.